War rages on. Tea gets thrown into the sea. People are shot, hung, tarred and feathered, all because of King George III.
George William Frederick was born on June 4th, 1738 in Wales, England. His mother, Augusta Felt, was the Princess of Wales, and his father, Frederick, was Prince. His grandfather was King George II, ruling over Wales, England when George was born.
George grew up with 8 siblings, 4 brothers and 4 sisters. During his childhood, he received an education from various tutors. His tutors taught him many subjects, but the ones that he enjoyed the most were music, architecture, and agriculture. He took little interest in anything else. One of his tutors, Lord Bute, was a Scottish aristocrat and also a very close friend of George's father, Prince Frederick. Lord Bute became George's main tutor and gave him most of his education. Tutors described George as lazy, immature, and eager to criticize others. George grew up within Windsor Castle. His father and mother wasted no time with him, always grooming him to be a king. However, at the age of 13, George's father died. He attended his funeral and paid his respects.
Directly after his grandfather's death, George was terrified about becoming king, for he was only 22. George had a good reason to be nervous about becoming king. After all, his country was in the first 4 years of the later to be called 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War had started as a struggle for territory between Austria and Prussia.
George's bitter opponent, William Pitt, was Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Pitt directed Great Britain's army. Pitt believed he could save his country, and nobody else could besides him. During the 7 Years' War, Great Britain had many victories, but the country was nearly bankrupt. Now that Britain was winning the war again, George and Bute had hoped to make a deal to end the fighting. Their enemies had offered to make a deal, but Pitt turned it down because he wanted them destroyed. George and Bute kept pressing their case of making a deal in the cabinet, while Pitt was wanting to destroy their opponent. George and Bute ended up victorious, and peace was made. Because of his loss, Pitt resigned in October of 1761. George believed the war finally ended, but soon he realized it hadn't. Afterwards, peace with France broke down, and in January of 1762, Britain was forced into war with Spain, just as he had predicted. Because of this, George had become heartbroken. He begged Bute to take the job as Prime Minister, and Bute finally gave in to the king's pleas. By the end of 1762, the Treaty of Paris was made, ending the war. This gave King George the right to land in Canada and Florida. Now that the war had settled down, George began his quest for a family and discovers his wife, Duchess Sophia Charlotte. They were married on September 8, 1761, a few days after they had met. Over the next 20 years, George and Charlotte would have 15 children. George was strict with his children to ensure their royal honor.
Because of George's belief, he thought it was important that everyone went to church on Sunday. Because of this, he passed a law stating one must attend church every Sunday. Soon after, he realized that his subjects in Britain were the least of his worry. He realized his new territories in America needed to be defended and governed. The new colonies demanded his utmost attention. The first thing King George decided to do to the colonies was give them the Proclamation Line of 1763, stating that the settlers must stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists despised this, and they wrote letters and petitions to King George demanding change. However, King George passed the Sugar Act, requiring the settlers to pay taxes on molasses.
These taxes helped pay for the British soldiers stationed in the colonies. Anyone who tried to smuggle untaxed molasses would be arrested. In March of 1765, Prime Minister Grenville pushed the Stamp Act through Parliament. This law required colonists to pay for an official seal or stamp that would be attached to your documents, newspapers, almanacs, and playing. In July of that year, George became angry and brooded for weeks. His physician told George he had developed a severe cold. He slept only 2 hours and felt anxious all the time.
George had a good reason to be nervous. As the summer ended, more colonists started to protest against the new laws. The colonists swarmed the home of the Stamp Commissioner and ransacked the home of the colony's lieutenant governor. By November, every Stamp Commissioner had quit their job in fear. George hated any signs of weakness. Due to this, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. This act stated that Britain had the right to make laws governing the colonies in all cases. George had to find a new prime minister, and because of Pitt's intelligence, he came back. While Pitt lay in bed, George and Parliament tried once again to raise more money from the colonists. In November 1767, the Townshend Act was passed, placing taxes on certain household goods imported into the country. One of these items included tea. To make sure the colonists did not smuggle these items, Britain doubled their efforts to catch these thieves. In the summer of 1760, British soldiers in Boston seized a cargo ship owned by an American. Angry mobs gathered in the streets, protesting. In October, General Gage sent 2 regiments of soldiers to enforce the tax laws. As the soldiers would go through the towns, people would gather in doorways to yell insults at them. Day after day, week after week, tempers grew shorter and conflicts more often. Finally, on the night of March 5th, 1770, the tension erupted into violence. It started with someone taunting a British officer for failing to pay a bill. Another soldier joined the argument and hit the person with his musket. Eventually, a crowd gathered to throw snowballs at the soldiers. Within a few hours, more British soldiers arrived, facing a crowd of 300 to 400. The frightened soldiers formed a semicircle, muskets. Suddenly, a soldier was hit with a club. The soldier struggled to his feet and fired his musket into the crowd. Seconds later, all of the soldiers did as well. By the time the smoke was clear, 11 Bostonians were wounded and later 5 dead. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. This caused Parliament to repeal all taxes except for one, the tax on tea. Around this time, George hired a new prime minister. His name was Lord North.
More protesting came from the American colonists. Instead of paying the tax on tea, the colonists began to smuggle tea leaves in large amounts. On December 6, 1773, Dartmouth, a British ship, came into the Boston harbor. During the night, a group of rebels disguised as Indians with a mohawk boarded the ship, broke open the tea chests with tomahawks, and dumped the tea into the harbor. They then grabbed a customs official from his bed and tarred and feathered him. After this, the customs official was very badly hurt, but survived. In May of 1774, General Gage arrived in Boston to make sure that the law was enforced. His orders were to maintain peace using force, only if you had to. George hoped that a strong response in Massachusetts would intimidate the other colonies so that they submit to his reign.
By the end of 1774, it looked as if George would have to fight to hold his empire. That September, Gage's soldiers found a stash of gunpowder in Somerville, Massachusetts. This, they discovered, the rebels already had prepared for war. Gage soon found out that the rebels were collecting weapons and ammunition in many different places. On the night of April 18th, 75, 700 British soldiers rode out of Boston up the Charles River to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock in Lexington. Then, they were going to conquer and destroy all of their armory. Thanks to Paul Revere's ride and other messengers, nobody was arrested and nothing was destroyed. Gage's troop marched into Lexington to find 70 militiamen guarding the town green with rifles. Both sides formed a firing line, and suddenly a shot rang out, though nobody knew who fired it. Thus, the American Revolution had begun. During the fall and winter of 1776, the king was pleased with the war's progress. British troops chased General Washington out of New York and into New Jersey. By December, Washington had retreated as far west as Pennsylvania. Washington's 6,000 hungry and freezing soldiers camped in the snow by the Delaware River. On the other side were 1,400 well-supplied Hessian mercenaries waiting for orders to attack their Americans. On Christmas night, George Washington rallied all his men and took the soldiers who were healthy enough to fight and led them across the river. Washington's men, of which many were marching barefoot, attacked the Hessians. Throughout the winter of 1778, there was an unspoken cease of fire. General Howe's regiment spent the winter in style, taking over expensive homes in Philadelphia. General Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, 18 miles out of the city. During the winter, hundreds of American soldiers froze to death or died of disease, but those who survived trained harder than they ever had before. The rebel army got a lift from England's enemy, the French. They signed a treaty showing the United States as a new nation. They pledged soldiers, ships, and money to help defeat Britain. During 1779 and 1780, the British went through the southern colonies to hopefully motivate the Redcoats to defeat the heart of the rebel army. But unfortunately for them, the rebels recaptured Georgia and South Carolina. By July of 17, General Lord Cornwallis fell back to Virginia. While there, he waited for the British Navy to bring his army back to New York. The Navy never arrived. In September, the rebel army of American and French soldiers came into Virginia, and by October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. Word of defeat spread throughout London a month later. Most of Parliament gave up hope of winning the war. The king came up with a plan to keep the rebels harassed, anxious, and poor. All of Parliament quickly rejected the king's plan. By September 1783, Parliament recognized the United States as a free nation. George did not attend the ceremonies or the signing of the treaty. By now, the rebels were happy, the war was ended. George would forever go down in history as the king who lost America. He finally died in 1820 at the age of 81 due to porphyria. He had spent nearly 60 years